3, 2, 1, the moment will come.
The concrete gave way beneath Gideon Bellamy's feet like a trapdoor to nightmare. One moment, he was checking the support beams in the parking structure's basement level. The next, he was falling 12 feet into a sinkhole that shouldn't exist. His safety helmet cracked against a twisted piece of rebar, and water rushed in from a burst main somewhere above. As emergency sirens wailed overhead and voices shouted through the widening crack, Gideon lay pinned under debris, his left leg twisted at an angle that made his stomach turn. The pain was extraordinary, but what happened next changed everything. A phone tumbled through the opening above him, landing 3 feet away. The screen was cracked but still glowing, and a voice drifted from the speaker. "Yeah, Camilla's taken care of while her husband's out of the picture," the voice said. "SD. Development's got everything covered. She won't be a problem when the permits come through next week." Gideon's blood turned to ice water. His wife's name. His wife who was supposed to be at her book club tonight. The same wife who'd kissed him goodbye this morning and reminded him to be careful on the job site. "Good," another voice replied through the phone speaker. "Make sure she understands the timeline. Once this inspection mess gets buried, we move forward with the waterfront project. No delays." The phone went dead. Above him, workers were yelling about getting a crane, about stabilizing the structure. Someone was crying about losing their phone. But Gideon barely heard them. His mind was processing information like a computer running diagnostics. SD development. He'd seen those blueprints cross his desk before. Soren Dyke's company. The man who'd been pushing questionable permits through the city planning office for months. 20 minutes later, paramedics pulled him from the hole. News cameras caught every second as they loaded him onto a stretcher. The reporter thrust a microphone toward his face. "Mr. Bellamy, can you tell us what happened down there?" Gideon looked directly into the camera, his face streaked with dirt and blood. "I fell," he said quietly. "But I'm seeing things much clearer now." He said nothing about the phone call, nothing about his wife's name floating through that digital conversation like a ghost. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, his eyes found the construction worker who was patting his pockets frantically, looking for his missing phone. The man was young, maybe 25, with Dyke Construction embroidered on his hard hat. 3 days later, Gideon sat in his living room, with his leg in a cast, watching Camilla fuss over him like a devoted wife. She brought him soup, fluffed his pillows, and asked about his pain medication schedule with the kind of attention she hadn't shown him in months. "The doctor said you might have some memory issues from the head trauma," Camilla said, settling beside him on the couch. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless even though it was barely noon. "Do you remember everything that happened?" Gideon looked at her with what he hoped appeared to be confusion. "It's all pretty fuzzy," he lied. "I remember falling, then waking up in the hospital. Everything in between is just gone." Relief flickered across her face so quickly he almost missed it. "Well, that's probably for the best. Traumatic memories can be difficult to process. She was beautiful, his wife of 8 years. Beautiful and ambitious and completely fake. How had he never noticed how fake her smiles were? "I'm going to run some errands," Camilla announced, checking her phone. "Faye wants to meet for lunch. You know how she gets when I cancel." Faye Weston, Camilla's best friend since college. The woman who'd encouraged Camilla to find herself and not settle for mediocrity ever since Gideon had been passed over for the supervisor position at work 2 years ago. "Take your time," Gideon said. "I'll just be here watching TV." After she left, he moved faster than any man with a broken leg should be able to move. The crutches were awkward, but determination made up for mobility. He went straight to their home office and Camilla's laptop. She'd always been careless with passwords, using variations of their wedding date or their dog's name. It took him 4 tries to get into her email account. What he found there made his hands shake. Dozens of messages to and from an account labeled SD_private. The most recent was from 2 days ago. "Cam, hope hubby recovers soon. Can't wait to celebrate the waterfront deal closing. Our future starts now." Her reply, "He doesn't remember anything from the accident. We're clear. Just need to be careful until the divorce papers are ready. Love you." Gideon sat back in the chair, staring at the screen. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of him working 50-hour weeks to pay for her yoga classes and shopping trips and girls' weekends. 8 years of believing they were building something together. He scrolled further back through the emails. 6 months of correspondence. Plans, intimate messages, financial discussions about something called Shoreline Holdings LLC. The front door opened. Gideon closed the laptop and grabbed his crutches, making it back to the couch just as Camilla walked into the living room. "How was lunch?" he asked. "Oh, you know Faye. Same drama, different day." She sat down beside him, her perfume stronger than usual. Different than usual, too, more expensive. "She's excited about some new business venture." Gideon nodded and smiled. "That's nice, honey." That night, after Camilla fell asleep, he installed keylogger software on her laptop and placed a voice-activated recorder under their kitchen table. If she wanted to play games, he'd learn the rules first. The next morning at work, Gideon found his supervisor, Dale Morrison, waiting by his desk with a stack of files. "Bellamy, glad you're back," Dale said. "We need to talk about some of your recent inspection reports." Gideon's stomach dropped. "What about them?" "The dike development projects from last month. There are some discrepancies in your documentation." Dale opened the top file and spread several papers across Gideon's desk. Official city inspection forms, all bearing Gideon's signature, all approving structural work that Gideon had never seen. "I didn't sign these," Gideon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your signature's right there," Dale pointed out. "And the dates match your scheduled inspections." But Gideon knew his own handwriting, knew his own signature better than anyone. These were good forgeries, but they were still forgeries. Someone had been using his inspector credentials to approve substandard work. "Dale, I need to make some calls. Can you give me an hour?" "Sure, but we need this sorted by end of day." The city's asking questions. After Dale left, Gideon sat alone with the forged documents, understanding finally why that sinkhole had opened up beneath him. Why Soren Dyke's construction worker had been on site that day with a phone full of incriminating conversations. He wasn't just being cheated on, he was being framed. His phone buzzed with a text from his coworker, Reggie Miles. "Coffee break?" "Need to talk." Reggie was waiting in the parking lot beside his pickup truck, smoking a cigarette and looking nervous. He was a quiet man in his 50s, the kind of person who noticed everything but said little. "You see those files Dale showed you?" Reggie asked without preamble. "Yeah, someone's been signing my name to approvals I never made." Reggie nodded grimly. "Figured. I've been keeping track of the job sites you've actually visited versus what's in the system. There's about a dozen discrepancies over the past 6 months." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I thought you were in on it," Reggie admitted. "But after seeing your face just now, I know you're not." Gideon leaned against the truck, his leg throbbing. "Reggie, I need your help with something. But it's not official business." "What kind of help?" "The kind that might get us both fired." Reggie dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "I'm listening." That evening, Gideon and Reggie sat in Reggie's truck across the street from the Meridian Hotel downtown, watching the entrance through binoculars. The voice recorder from Gideon's kitchen had picked up a phone call that afternoon. Camilla telling someone she'd meet at the usual place at 7. At 7:15, Camilla's silver BMW pulled into the hotel's valet area. She stepped out wearing a red dress that Gideon had never seen before, something that probably cost more than his monthly salary. 5 minutes later, a black Mercedes arrived. The man who got out was tall, tanned, and wearing a suit that screamed money. Soren Dyke in person. "That's him," Gideon said. "That's the bastard." They watched Camilla and Soren embrace in the hotel lobby, watched them walk toward the elevators like lovers who'd been separated for years instead of hours. "You want to go in there?" Reggie asked. "No? I want to be smart about this." They waited. 2 hours later, Camilla and Soren emerged, both looking satisfied and relaxed. They kissed goodbye in the lobby, long and passionate, completely oblivious to the two men watching from across the street. "Jesus, Gideon. I'm sorry, man." Gideon lowered the binoculars. "Don't be sorry. Be ready to help me burn their world down." The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of playing the confused, injured husband while systematically dismantling the lies that had become his life. The keylogger revealed everything. Camilla's real feelings about their marriage, her plans to divorce him after something called the waterfront deal, and most importantly, her involvement in a company called Shoreline Holdings. Public records showed that Shoreline Holdings was owned by Faye Weston, Camilla's best friend. Private records, obtained through methods Gideon preferred not to think about too closely, showed that Shoreline was a shell company designed to launder bribes for Soren's development projects. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Soren would identify properties he wanted to develop, then pay bribes through Shoreline Holdings to ensure proper permits and inspections. Camilla, as an inspector's wife, provided inside information about scheduling and procedures. Faye handled the financial arrangements, and Gideon's forged signature was their insurance policy. If anything went wrong, if any of Soren's buildings failed inspection or, God forbid, collapsed and hurt someone, Gideon would take the blame. "They've been planning this for months," he told Reggie as they sat in a diner at midnight, surrounded by surveillance photos and financial documents. "The affair is just a bonus. The real prize is the waterfront development project. $60 million in city contracts." "So, what's the play?" Reggie asked. Gideon had been thinking about that question for 3 weeks. The old Gideon would have confronted Camilla, would have demanded explanations and apologies. The old Gideon would have gone to the police and trusted the system to handle things fairly. But the old Gideon had died in that sinkhole, buried under concrete and betrayal. "We're going to destroy them," he said quietly. "All of them. But we're going to be careful about it, one piece at a time." The first move was psychological warfare. Gideon had learned that Soren was married to a woman named Patricia, a socialite who threw charity galas and took pride in her family's reputation. She had no idea about her husband's affair. On a Tuesday morning, Patricia Dyke received a bouquet of roses at her country club, along with a note written in Camilla's handwriting. "Thanks for sharing your husband. The baby will have his eyes." See, Camilla wasn't actually pregnant. That was just something from her email fantasies. But Patricia didn't know that. By Wednesday, Patricia had hired a private investigator. By Friday, she was photographing Soren and Camilla at their hotel meetings. The second move was financial. Gideon had always handled the household finances, but Camilla had opened several accounts he didn't know about. Accounts funded by Shoreline Holdings, accounts that legally she had no right to since they contained the proceeds of criminal activity. With Reggie's help and some creative identity verification, Gideon transferred every dollar from those accounts into a frozen trust fund. Camilla wouldn't be able to access the money without proving its legitimate source, which she couldn't do without admitting to the bribery scheme. The third move was professional. Gideon anonymously contacted the EPA, OSHA, and the State Construction Oversight Board, providing detailed documentation of every forged inspection report, every substandard building material, every safety violation that Soren's company had covered. By the end of the month, Dyke Development was under investigation by 4 separate agencies. But Gideon wasn't finished, not even close. The Metro Chamber of Commerce's annual fundraising gala was the social event of the year, attended by every politician, developer, and social climber in the city. Camilla had been excited about it for weeks, shopping for the perfect dress and talking about the networking opportunities. She had no idea that Gideon had also bought a ticket. He watched from across the ballroom as she worked the room in a gold sequined dress that probably cost more than his car payment. She was radiant, confident, completely in her element. Faye Weston stood beside her, the two women laughing and drinking champagne like they owned the world. At 9:30, just as the evening's speakers were taking the stage, 2 things happened simultaneously. First, a process server approached Camilla's table and handed her a legal document. She opened it with a confused smile that quickly transformed into horror as she read the contents. It was a civil lawsuit filed by the families of 3 construction workers who had been injured at Dyke Development job sites, naming her specifically as a co-conspirator in the inspection fraud scheme. Second, the ballroom's projection system, which was supposed to be showing slides about the chamber's community initiatives, began displaying a very different set of images. Hotel security footage, timestamps and date stamps clearly visible. Camilla and Soren in passionate embraces, entering hotel rooms together, kissing goodbye in parking garages. The ballroom fell silent, except for the horrified gasps of 500 of the city's most prominent citizens watching Camilla's affair play out in high-definition detail on 3 giant screens. Camilla stood frozen at her table, the lawsuit papers scattered at her feet, her face illuminated by the glow from the projectors showing her betrayal to everyone she'd ever wanted to impress. Faye was already moving toward the exit, abandoning her friend without a backward glance. Soren, who had been at the bar when the show started, was nowhere to be seen. And Gideon, watching from the back of the ballroom, felt something cold and satisfying settle in his chest. This was what justice looked like. This was what betrayal earned. He slipped out through the kitchen exit before anyone noticed him, leaving Camilla to face the aftermath alone. 3 days later, Camilla was served with divorce papers at the house. Gideon was at work, maintaining his cover as the oblivious husband, when she called him sobbing. "Gideon, someone's trying to destroy us," she cried into the phone. "They're saying terrible things about me and Faye. They've frozen my accounts." "I don't understand what's happening." "Slow down," Gideon said, proud of how concerned he sounded. "What accounts? What are you talking about?" "My business accounts, the ones for my consulting work." He'd never known about any consulting work. "Honey, you're not making sense. Come home and we'll figure this out together." But when he got home that evening, Camilla was gone. Her clothes, her jewelry, her laptop, everything important to her had been packed and removed. She'd left a note on the kitchen table. "Gideon, I can't involve you in this mess. Some people are trying to hurt me and I need to protect you. I'll call when it's safe. I love you." See, even her goodbye was a lie. She didn't love him, didn't want to protect him. She was running because her world was collapsing and she needed distance from the debris field. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Yeah? Mr. Bellamy? This is Detective April Keneally with the Fraud Division. I'd like to ask you some questions about your wife's business activities." "I'm sorry, Detective, but I don't know anything about my wife's business. I'm just a building inspector." "Right. That's actually what we need to discuss. Your inspection reports, specifically some irregularities we've discovered." Gideon's blood ran cold. "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that suggests someone's been forging your signature on official documents. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" After hanging up, Gideon sat in his empty house and smiled. The detective's call wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. If he played this right, he could position himself as another victim of Soren and Camilla's scheme rather than an accomplice. But first, he needed to find his wife. Tracking Camilla turned out to be easier than expected. She'd been using the same credit card she'd always used, the one tied to their joint checking account. Gas stations, restaurants, and hotel charges painted a clear picture of her flight west toward the state line. She was running to her sister's house in Indianapolis. Predictable. Gideon didn't follow her immediately. Instead, he spent 2 weeks carefully constructing his defense with Detective Keneally, providing evidence that his signatures had been forged, demonstrating that he'd been victimized by the same conspiracy that was defrauding the city. The detective was sympathetic and professional, exactly the kind of law enforcement officer who wanted to believe that regular people were innocent until proven otherwise. "Mr. Bellamy, I have to ask, did you suspect anything unusual about your wife's activities?" Gideon sat in the police station interview room, playing the part of the confused, betrayed husband. "Detective, I thought my wife was selling beauty products online. That's what she told me her consulting work was about. I had no idea she was involved with developers or construction permits. And you never noticed any unusual income?" "Expensive purchases. She said her business was doing well. I was proud of her." Detective Keneally made notes in her file. "We've traced over $200,000 moving through accounts associated with your wife and her friend Faye Weston. Money that appears to have come from Dyke Development through shell companies." "Jesus," Gideon whispered, genuinely shocked by the amount. 200,000? Maybe more. "We're still tracing the transactions." When the interview was over, Detective Keneally walked him to the parking lot. "Mr. Bellamy, I want you to know that you're not a suspect in this investigation. You're a victim. If you need any assistance with the divorce proceedings or financial recovery, the department can connect you with resources. Thank you, Detective. I appreciate everything you're doing." As he drove home, Gideon felt a grim satisfaction. He was officially a victim now, which meant he could act like one, which meant he could do things that victims were entitled to do, like getting his life back, like getting revenge. Camilla's sister Margaret lived in a suburban neighborhood 40 minutes outside Indianapolis, in a house that looked like every other house on the street, except for the silver BMW in the driveway. Gideon had been watching the house for 6 hours from his position in a McDonald's parking lot across the street, using binoculars and noting the patterns. Margaret left for work at 7:30 a.m. Her husband followed at 8:15. Camilla didn't emerge until nearly noon, and when she did, she looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, no makeup, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like a woman whose world had collapsed around her. Good. Gideon followed her to a strip mall where she bought groceries and visited a pack-and-ship store. Through the window, he watched her boxing up personal items, probably things she wanted to mail somewhere safe before the legal system froze more of her assets. When she left the shipping store, Gideon was waiting by her car. "Hello, Camilla." She dropped her car keys, her face going white with shock. "Gideon, what are you doing here? We need to talk." "I can't. My lawyer said I shouldn't discuss anything with anyone until this mess gets sorted out." "Your lawyer?" Gideon smiled. "What mess are we talking about exactly?" Camilla looked around the parking lot like she was expecting someone to rescue her. "The false accusations. Someone's trying to frame me for things I didn't do. Like sleeping with Sorendike?" Her face crumpled. "Gideon, please. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. I've seen the hotel footage, Camilla. The whole city's seen it. That was a mistake. A terrible mistake. I was confused and lonely, and he took advantage of me." Gideon studied his wife's face, looking for any trace of the woman he'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. All he saw was a stranger wearing familiar features, someone who lied as easily as breathing. "Confused about what? About our marriage? About the $250,000 you stole?" "I didn't steal anything." "That money was payment for consulting work. What kind of consulting involves forging your husband's signature on inspection reports?" Camilla's eyes went wide. I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying." Gideon's voice was quiet, calm, and absolutely cold. "I know about Shoreline Holdings. I know about the bribes. I know about the forged inspections. I know everything." She started crying then, big dramatic sobs that might have moved him once upon a time. Now they just sounded like noise. "Gideon, please. I made mistakes, but I was trying to build something for us. A better life. The inspector's salary was never going to be enough for the things we wanted." "The things you wanted," he corrected. "I was perfectly happy with our life. Happy living paycheck to paycheck? Happy watching everyone else get ahead while we stayed stuck?" "Yes, because it was honest." Camilla wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara. "So what happens now? Are you going to turn me in?" Gideon looked at this woman who had shared his bed for 8 years, who had promised to love him through better and worse, who had thrown away everything they'd built together for money and excitement, and a man who would abandon her the moment things got difficult. "I don't need to turn you in," he said. "You've already been turned in. The FBI, the state attorney general, the IRS, they all have files on you now, with documentation, with evidence. Evidence you gave them? Evidence you created when you decided to commit federal crimes." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working, see her trying to find an angle, a way to manipulate him back onto her. Sighed. "We could disappear," she said suddenly. "Both of us. I know where Soren keeps cash hidden. We could take it and leave the country, start over somewhere new. You want me to help you steal more money and flee the country? I want us to be together." "Like we used to be?" Gideon almost laughed. "Like we used to be? When was that exactly? When you were secretly planning to divorce me? When you were forging my signature? When you were fucking another man in hotel rooms? I was going to tell you about the divorce after the deal was finished. I was going to make sure you got half of everything. Half of stolen money. Half of $2 million, Gideon. Enough to retire, enough to travel, enough to live however we wanted." For just a moment, he could see the appeal. $2 million was more money than he'd earn in a lifetime of building inspections. Enough to disappear, to reinvent himself, to never worry about bills or broken appliances, or whether he could afford to fix his truck. But it was stolen money. Money taken from families who trusted that buildings were safe, that inspections were honest, that the system worked the way it was supposed to work. Money that might have cost lives if those buildings had collapsed. "No," he said simply. "No? No. I won't help you. I won't run with you. I won't pretend that any of this is okay. Camilla's face hardened. Fine. But you should know that I'm not going down alone. If they prosecute me, I'll tell them you were involved from the beginning. I'll say you knew about everything. Go ahead. I'm serious, Gideon. I have emails that could be interpreted as you giving me inside information about inspection schedules. I have bank records showing money flowing into our joint accounts. I can make this very bad for you. Gideon reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder. He pressed stop and held it up so she could see it. You just threatened to commit perjury and frame an innocent person for federal crimes, he said, while being recorded, after admitting your guilt to multiple felonies. Camilla's mouth fell open. Detective Keneally is going to love this, Gideon continued, especially the part where you offered to help me steal money and flee the country. You bastard. I'm a bastard? I'm not the one who destroyed our marriage for money. I'm not the one who committed crimes. I'm not the one who just threatened to send an innocent person to prison. He pocketed the recorder and started walking toward his truck. Where are you going? Camilla called after him. Home, to my life. The honest one you thought wasn't good enough? Gideon, wait. Please. We can work this out. He didn't turn around, didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge her voice calling his name across the parking lot. He'd wasted enough words on her already. The arrest warrants were issued 3 days later. Camilla was taken into custody at her sister's house at 6 a.m. by federal agents. Soren was arrested at his office downtown, where he'd been desperately trying to shred documents and transfer assets offshore. Faye Weston was the smart one. She'd hired an attorney immediately after the Chamber of Commerce disaster and negotiated a plea deal, agreeing to testify against her co-conspirators in exchange for reduced charges. Gideon watched it all unfold from his living room, following the news coverage with the same detached interest he might show for a sporting event. The local reporters called it the biggest corruption scandal in the city's history. Federal prosecutors were talking about prison sentences measured in decades. Detective Keneally called to update him on the case. Mr. Bellamy, I wanted you to know that your wife attempted to implicate you in the conspiracy during her initial interview. I figured she might. Well, the recording you provided pretty much destroyed any credibility she might have had. Her attorney's already talking about a guilty plea. What kind of sentence is she looking at? With the federal charges, the money laundering, the fraud, probably 8 to 12 years if she cooperates. More if she doesn't. 8 to 12 years. Gideon tried to feel something about that, sadness, regret, even satisfaction, but mostly he just felt tired. Detective, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think I'm a bad person for recording that conversation with her? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Bellamy, your wife committed serious crimes that could have gotten people killed. She tried to frame you for those crimes. She threatened to perjure herself to send you to prison. Recording that conversation wasn't bad. It was smart. After hanging up, Gideon sat in his empty house and tried to figure out what came next. The divorce would be finalized within months. The criminal cases would drag on for years, but they wouldn't require much from him beyond occasional testimony. He was 42 years old, with a job he didn't hate and a house that was finally quiet. No lies, no schemes, no betrayals lurking in the shadows. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like ending. 6 months later, Gideon was inspecting a new apartment complex when his phone rang. Unknown number, but he recognized the area code. Federal prison in Kentucky. This is a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Correctional Institution. Will you accept charges? He almost hung up. Almost, but curiosity won. Yeah, I'll accept. Gideon? Camilla's voice sounded small and distant. Thank God, I wasn't sure you'd take my call. What do you want, Camilla? I wanted to apologize for everything. I know that probably doesn't mean much now, but I needed to say it. Gideon leaned against his truck, watching construction workers pour concrete for a foundation that he'd actually inspect properly, with his real signature on honest reports. Okay, he said. You've said it. That's it? Just okay? What did you expect? I don't know. Maybe some indication that you forgive me? Gideon thought about that. Forgiveness. The word felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd never learned to speak. I don't forgive you, he said finally. But I don't hate you either. I just don't feel anything about you at all. That's worse than hate. Yeah, I suppose it is. There was a long silence on the line. Prison calls were expensive, and Camilla's commissary account was probably limited, but she didn't seem to be in a hurry to hang up. "How's Soren doing?" Gideon asked, genuinely curious. 15 years. His wife divorced him and took everything. He's in a different facility. And Faye? 2 years, served 18 months. She's out now. Won't return my calls. Smart woman. Gideon, do you ever think about what might have happened if I'd just talked to you? If I'd told you I was unhappy instead of... She trailed off. Instead of committing federal crimes and cheating on me. Yes. Gideon considered the question seriously. Would talking have saved their marriage? Would honesty have been enough? No, he said. I don't think it would have mattered. The problem wasn't that you were unhappy. The problem was who you are. Who I am. Someone who thinks she deserves more than she's earned. Someone who believes other people exist to give her what she wants. Someone who lies instead of working and steals instead of building. That's not fair. Fair? Gideon laughed, surprising himself. You want to talk about fair? You destroyed our marriage. You tried to destroy my career. You committed crimes that could have gotten people killed. And you tried to send me to prison to save yourself. And you think my assessment of your character isn't fair? I made mistakes. You made choices. Every single day for months, you chose to lie to me. You chose to betray me. You chose to commit crimes. Don't call them mistakes. Mistakes are accidents. What you did was deliberate. The line was quiet for so long that Gideon thought she might have hung up. I'm sorry, she said finally. I really am sorry. I know you are. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you're in prison. You're sorry your life didn't turn out the way you wanted. But you're not sorry for what you did to me. If you could go back and do it all again, but without getting caught this time, you'd make the same choices. That's not true, isn't it? Another long silence. When Camilla spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Maybe it is. Yeah, maybe it is. So what happens now? Do we just never speak again? Gideon looked up at the apartment building rising around him, at the honest work being done by people who showed up every day and did their jobs properly. Simple work. Clean work. Work that built things instead of tearing them down. I think that would be best, he said. Gideon? Yeah? I hope you find someone who appreciates what you are. I already have. Who? Me. He hung up before she could respond, and he never answered another call from that number. 1 year later, Gideon was promoted to senior inspector. Not because he'd been involved in exposing a major corruption scandal. He'd never publicized his role in that. But because he was good at his job and showed up every day and filed honest reports. The promotion came with a raise and a better office and responsibility for training new inspectors. It also came with respect, something he'd never realized he'd been missing during his marriage. His coworkers trusted him. His supervisors relied on him. The contractors he dealt with knew that his approval meant something, that his signature carried weight because it was never given lightly. He'd built a reputation slowly, honestly, one inspection at a time. The house felt different now, too. Not empty, quiet. There was a difference. Empty suggested something missing. Quiet suggested peace. Reggie stopped by on Friday evenings sometimes, and they'd sit on the back porch drinking beer and talking about work, about fishing, about anything except the past. Reggie had been promoted, too, to lead inspector, and he wore the responsibility well. You ever regret it? Reggie asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the city skyline. Taking them down the way you did? Gideon thought about the question. Did he regret destroying his wife's life? Did he regret the methodical, careful way he dismantled everything she'd built with lies and theft? No, he said finally. But I regret that it was necessary. Think you'll ever get married again? Maybe. If I find someone who understands that building something real takes time. Someone who doesn't mistake patience for weakness. Reggie nodded and took a long drink from his beer. Someone who appreciates what you built instead of resenting what you didn't. Exactly. They sat in comfortable silence. Two men who'd learned that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones. Sometimes justice wasn't dramatic or satisfying. Sometimes it was just the slow, steady work of making sure the truth came to light. On his nightstand, Gideon kept a newspaper clipping from the day Camilla's sentencing was announced. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that actions had consequences, that choices mattered, that the person you chose to be determined the life you ended up living. 8 years and 4 months in federal prison. Restitution in the amount of $347,000. Permanent disbarment from any work involving city contracts or inspections. The article included a quote from the prosecutor. This case demonstrates that corruption at any level will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The defendant's crimes undermined public safety and betrayed the trust of every citizen who depends on honest government oversight. Below that was a smaller quote from Soren's sentencing. 15 years federal prison. $2.3 million in restitution and fines. And at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, City Inspector Gideon Bellamy, whose forged signature was used to approve substandard construction, has been cleared of all wrongdoing and commended for his cooperation with the investigation. Commended for his cooperation. That made him smile sometimes. If they only knew what cooperation really looked like. But they didn't need to know. The system had worked, justice had been served, and the buildings in his city were a little bit safer because 3 criminals were in prison instead of on the street. That was enough. 2 years after Camilla's arrest, Gideon met Sarah Chen at a community planning meeting. She was an architect, recently divorced, with a 10-year-old daughter and a practical approach to life that he found refreshing. She drove a 12-year-old Honda that she maintained herself. She lived in a modest house that she'd bought with her own money. She worked hard, saved carefully, and never once suggested that her current life wasn't good enough. Their first date was coffee and a walk through the city's historic district, looking at buildings and talking about construction, about design, about the importance of honest work honestly done. "You know what I like about you?" Sarah said as they stood in front of a century-old courthouse that had been built to last. "What's that?" "You understand that good things take time. Most people want everything immediately, but you seem to get that the best things are worth waiting for." Gideon looked at her, this woman who talked about foundation repair with the same enthusiasm that other people reserve for vacation plans, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "I've learned that shortcuts usually lead to problems," he said. "Exactly. My ex-husband was always looking for shortcuts. Get-rich-quick schemes, miracle diets, ways to skip steps and get results anyway. It never worked, but he never stopped trying." "What happened?" "He finally found a shortcut that worked, straight out of our marriage and into his secretary's apartment." Gideon winced. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Best thing that ever happened to me. Taught me to value substance over flash." They were married 18 months later, in a small ceremony at the courthouse they'd admired on their first date. Sarah's daughter, Emma, served as ring bearer, and Reggie was Gideon's best man. The reception was a backyard barbecue with 30 people, 3 cases of beer, and a cake that Sarah had baked herself. It was simple, honest, and completely perfect. During his brief speech, Gideon looked out at the faces of the people who mattered to him. Colleagues, neighbors, friends who'd stood by him through the hardest period of his life, and realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not dramatic, not flashy, not expensive, just real. "To Sarah," he said, raising his beer bottle, "who taught me that the best foundations are built slowly, carefully, and honestly." "To both of you," Reggie called out, "who prove that good things happen to people who do things right." Everyone drank. To that. And Gideon felt a satisfaction deeper than any revenge he'd ever planned. 5 years after Camilla's sentencing, Gideon received a letter forwarded through his attorney. Prison mail, postmarked from Kentucky. He almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of him. "Gideon, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I'm writing this letter not because I expect forgiveness or even a response, but because my therapist says I need to take responsibility for what I did without expecting anything in return. I destroyed our marriage. I betrayed your trust. I committed crimes that put innocent people at risk. I tried to destroy your reputation to save myself. There's no excuse for any of it, and I'm not going to insult you by trying to provide one. I've spent 3 years in here thinking about the choices I made, and I finally understand something that I should have understood a long time ago. You were never the problem with our marriage. I was. You were honest, hardworking, loyal, and decent. You loved me exactly as I was, and you never asked me to be anything other than myself. The problem was that I didn't like who I was, and instead of working to become better, I decided that our life together wasn't good enough. I convinced myself that I deserved more than what we had, that I was entitled to wealth and excitement and status. I told myself that you were holding me back, that your contentment with our simple life was somehow a character flaw instead of a virtue. I was wrong about everything. I've seen what wealth without character looks like now. I've seen what happens when people choose excitement over stability, status over substance. It ends in places like this, surrounded by people who made the same kinds of choices I made. The woman I am now would be grateful for the life we had together. She would appreciate coming home to someone who loved her, who worked hard to provide for their family, who kept his promises and told the truth. She would understand that what we had was precious specifically because it was honest. But that woman learned these lessons too late. And she's not the woman you married. The woman you married was selfish and shallow and ultimately criminal. You were right to protect yourself from her. You were right to make sure she faced consequences for her actions. I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened to me. I don't blame you for recording our conversation or providing evidence to the authorities or refusing to help me escape justice. You did exactly what any decent person would do when confronted with what I had become. I hope you found happiness with someone who deserves you. I hope you've built the kind of life that I was too foolish to appreciate when I had the chance to be part of it. I won't contact you again. Camilla Gideon read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder of something important. People could change, but change had to come from within, and it usually came too late to repair the damage they'd done. He felt something like sadness for the woman who'd written that letter, who'd finally learned to value the things she'd thrown away. But he felt no regret for the choices he'd made, no desire to respond or reach out or offer forgiveness. Some bridges once burned were meant to stay that way. That evening, he told Sarah about the letter as they sat in their kitchen helping Emma with her homework. "How do you feel about it?" Sarah asked. "Glad she finally understands what she lost," Gideon said. "Glad I'm not part of her life anymore." Emma looked up from her math problems. "Dad, was she really that bad?" Gideon considered how to explain complicated adult failures to a 15-year-old. She made choices that hurt people. When someone shows you who they really are, it's important to believe them. But people can change, right? Sometimes. But change doesn't erase the consequences of previous choices. And the people who got hurt don't have to stick around to see if the change is real. Emma nodded seriously and went back to her algebra. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Gideon's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For building something real, instead of just tearing down something false." Gideon looked around his kitchen, at his wife grading architectural drawings, at his stepdaughter solving equations, at the life he'd constructed carefully and, honestly, over the course of years, and felt the deep satisfaction of work well done. He'd learned something important in the wreckage of his first marriage. Revenge was temporary, but character was permanent. Destroying his enemies had felt good for a while, but building a life worth living felt good forever. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Gideon was inspecting the foundation of a new library when his phone rang. Detective Kennelly, whom he hadn't heard from in over 2 years. "Mr. Bellamy? I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just work. What can I do for you, Detective?" "I wanted to let you know that Camilla Bellamy was released from federal custody yesterday. She served her full sentence and she's now on supervised probation." Gideon felt a flutter of something. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. "Okay, is there something I need to do?" "Not necessarily. Her probation conditions prohibit her from contacting you, or Sarah, or Emma without court approval. She's also not allowed to work in any capacity involving city contracts or government oversight." "Where is she?" "Indianapolis, near her sister. She'll be required to stay in that jurisdiction for the duration of her probation unless she gets permission to travel." "Detective, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you think she's actually changed? The letters, the therapy, the taking responsibility. Do you think any of that's real?" There was a pause. "Mr. Bellamy, I've been working fraud cases for 15 years. In my experience, people who commit the kind of premeditated crimes your ex-wife committed don't change their fundamental character. They might learn to hide it better, they might develop better impulse control, but the core personality that allowed them to commit those crimes in the first place, that doesn't usually change. So you think I should be worried? I think you should be aware. Keep doing what you're doing, living your life, building your career, taking care of your family. But if she shows up in your city, if she tries to contact you or anyone in your family, call me immediately. After hanging up, Gideon stood in the basement of the future library, surrounded by concrete and steel and honest construction, and tried to figure out how he felt about his ex-wife being free. Mostly, he realized, he felt nothing at all. She was a chapter in his life that had ended years ago. Her release from prison didn't change anything about his present or his future. But Detective Keneally was right about one thing. Awareness was important. Camilla had demonstrated a capacity for elaborate deception and calculated cruelty. The woman who'd written that remorseful letter from prison might be genuinely changed, but she might also be exactly what she'd always been. Someone who told people what they wanted to hear in order to get what she wanted. That evening, he mentioned the call to Sarah as they cleaned up after dinner. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. "Honestly, I don't feel much of anything. She's not part of our lives anymore." "But you're being careful." "I'm being aware." "There's a difference." Sarah nodded and continued loading the dishwasher. "Emma's at her dad's this weekend. Want to drive up to the lake, get away from the city for a couple days?" "That sounds perfect." And it did sound perfect. A weekend away with his wife, away from work and obligations and the complicated history that occasionally surfaced to remind him of who he used to be. He was a different person now than he'd been during his first marriage. Stronger, more confident, less willing to accept less than he deserved. The man who'd fallen in love with Camilla had been eager to please, quick to make excuses for other people's behavior, willing to overlook small betrayals in the name of keeping the peace. The man who'd married Sarah was none of those things. He'd learned to recognize manipulation, to trust his instincts, to set boundaries and enforce them. If Camilla ever did try to re-enter his life, she'd find a very different person than the one she'd left behind. But mostly, he hoped she'd learned enough in prison to stay away, for her sake as much as his. 6 months later, Gideon was promoted again, this time to district supervisor. The position came with oversight of 12 inspectors, responsibility for all construction oversight in the northern part of the city, and a salary that finally made him solidly middle class. More importantly, it came with the knowledge that he'd earned it through honest work and consistent excellence. No shortcuts, no compromises, no ethical corner cutting. The promotion party was held at Reggie's house, with most of the department in attendance. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, Reggie pulled Gideon aside. "You know what I respect most about you?" Reggie said. "What's that?" "You could have let what happened with Camilla make you bitter. You could have started seeing corruption everywhere, stopped trusting people, become one of those cynical bastards who thinks everyone's trying to cheat the system." "But I didn't." "No, you didn't. You kept doing good work. You kept trusting the right people. You kept believing that most folks are decent if you give them a chance to be." Gideon thought about that as he drove home. Reggie was right. He could have let Camilla's betrayal poison his view of the world, could have started seeing enemies and conspiracies everywhere. Instead, he'd learned to be more careful without becoming paranoid, more aware without becoming suspicious, more protective of himself without becoming isolated. He'd learned the difference between caution and fear, between standards and perfectionism, between justice and revenge. When he got home, Sarah was reading in bed, wearing one of his old work shirts and a pair of glasses that made her look like a very attractive librarian. "How was the party?" she asked, looking up from her book. "Good. Reggie gave a speech about how I've maintained my faith in humanity despite everything." "Have you?" Gideon considered the question as he changed into pajamas. "Yeah, I think I have. Camilla and Soren and Faye were criminals, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most people are honest. Most people do their jobs properly. Most people keep their promises. Most people don't betray the people who love them." "Exactly." Sarah closed her book and watched him brush his teeth. "I'm proud of you for choosing to believe that." "Why?" "Because it would have been easier to assume everyone was lying, safer to never trust anyone completely again." Gideon rinsed his mouth and turned to face her. "But then I never would have trusted you, and that would have been my loss as much as yours." He got into bed beside her, This woman who'd chosen him not despite his history, but because of how he'd handled it. Who'd seen the worst thing that had ever happened to him and decided that his response to it demonstrated strength rather than weakness. Sarah? Yeah? Thank you. For what? For giving me the chance to be the husband I always wanted to be. She turned off the light and settled against his shoulder. Thank you for being worth the chance. As he drifted off to sleep, Gideon thought about the strange arithmetic of justice. He'd lost a wife who'd never really loved him and gained a family that did. He'd lost money he'd never really had and gained a career he could be proud of. He'd lost illusions about human nature and gained wisdom about human character. In the end, Camilla's betrayal had cost him less than it had taught him. Her attempts to destroy his life had ultimately made it better. He supposed that was its own kind of revenge, not the dramatic, satisfying kind you saw in movies, but the quiet, lasting kind that came from refusing to let other people's failures define your future. The kind that came from building something real instead of just tearing down something false. The kind that lasted. 7 years after his divorce was finalized, Gideon Bellamy stood in front of the city council to present his annual report on construction oversight and safety compliance. The council chambers were packed with contractors, developers, city employees, and interested citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I'm proud to report that this year we achieved a 99.3% compliance rate on initial inspections, with 0 serious safety violations and no structural failures in any buildings under our oversight. Applause filled the chamber. Mayor Davidson nodded approvingly from the dais. This success is the result of consistent enforcement of building codes, thorough inspector training, and the cooperation of contractors who understand that safety isn't negotiable. After the meeting, as Gideon packed up his presentation materials, a young woman approached him. She looked familiar, but he couldn't place her. Mr. Bellamy, I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Tribune. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the corruption scandal from a few years ago. Now he remembered her. She'd been covering city government when Camilla and Soren were arrested, though she'd been much newer to the job then. What kind of questions? Well, there are rumors that you played a larger role in exposing the corruption than was ever reported. Some people say you actually orchestrated the investigation. Gideon smiled. Miss Walsh, I was a victim of that corruption, not the person who exposed it. The credit belongs to Detective Keneally and the federal prosecutors who built the case. But the timing of events, the way evidence surfaced, the coordination between different agencies, it suggests someone with inside knowledge was guiding the investigation. I provided evidence when asked. I cooperated fully with law enforcement. Beyond that, I think you're giving me credit for detective work that was done by actual detectives. Jennifer Walsh studied his face, clearly hoping for more. Do you ever think about what might have happened if that sinkhole accident hadn't occurred? If you hadn't overheard that phone conversation? I think about a lot of things, Miss Walsh. But I try to focus on the future rather than the past. Just one more question. Do you feel like justice was served? Gideon looked around the council chambers, at the city officials and contractors and citizens who depended on him to ensure that buildings were safe, that inspections were honest, that the system worked the way it was supposed to work. Justice was served when 3 criminals went to prison for their crimes, he said. But more importantly, the system was fixed. The safeguards that failed before have been strengthened. The oversight that was compromised has been restored. The buildings in this city are safer now than they were 7 years ago. So you're satisfied with the outcome? I'm satisfied that I did my job. Everything else was up to the courts. After the reporter left, Gideon walked to his truck in the parking garage, the same parking garage where Reggie had once rescued him from Soren's hired thugs. The structure had been reinforced since then, properly inspected, brought up to current safety standards. As he drove home through the city he'd helped protect, past buildings he'd personally inspected, through neighborhoods where families lived and worked safely because people like him did their jobs honestly, Gideon felt the deep satisfaction of work. Well done. He'd never told anyone the full truth about his role in exposing the corruption. He'd never claimed credit for the methodical way he'd dismantled his enemies. He'd never bragged about the precision with which he'd orchestrated their downfall. The victory was in the work itself, not in the recognition. The revenge was in the rebuilding, not in the destruction. The justice was in the prevention of future crimes, not in the punishment of past ones. When he got home, Emma was at the kitchen table working on college applications. Sarah was reviewing blueprints for a new municipal building, and dinner was waiting in the oven. "How did the presentation go?" Sarah asked without looking up from her drawings. "Good. Council approved the budget for next year." "Dad, can you help me with this essay?" Emma asked. "It's about overcoming challenges." Gideon hung up his jacket and sat down beside his stepdaughter. "What kind of challenges?" "Just, you know, difficult situations. Times when you had to be stronger than you thought you could be." He looked at Emma, this young woman who'd never known him during the worst period of his life, who saw him only as the steady, reliable man who'd married her mother and helped raise her with patience and wisdom. "What have you written so far?" "That's the problem. I can't think of any real challenges. My life's been pretty easy." Gideon smiled. "Emma, the fact that your life has been easy means that the adults around you have been doing their jobs right. That's not a problem. That's a blessing. But the essay is supposed to be about overcoming adversity. Then write about watching someone else overcome adversity. Write about your mother rebuilding her life after her divorce. Write about a teacher who helped you understand a difficult concept. Write about someone who impressed you with their strength." Emma brightened. "I could write about you." "Me?" "Mom told me about what happened with your first wife. How she betrayed you, but you didn't let it make you bitter. How you helped catch the people who were putting others at risk. How you built a better life instead of just complaining about the old one." Gideon felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with love. This young woman, who could have seen him as just her stepfather, instead saw him as someone worth admiring. "That's a good topic," he said. "But remember to focus on what you learned from observing that situation. What it taught you about resilience, about character, about the importance of doing the right thing even when it's difficult." "What did it teach you?" Emma asked. Gideon thought about that question as Sarah looked up from her blueprints, as the three of them sat around the kitchen table that had become the center of his real life. "It taught me that who you choose to be matters more than what happens to you," he said finally. "It taught me that the best revenge against people who try to destroy you is building something they can never touch." Emma wrote that down, then looked up at him with serious eyes. "Do you think she's really changed, your ex-wife?" "I don't know." "But it doesn't matter." "Why not?" "Because I changed. I became someone who doesn't need other people to be different in order for my life to be good." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Emma bent over her notebook, writing furiously. And Gideon Bellamy, district supervisor, husband, father, and survivor, sat in his kitchen surrounded by the family he'd chosen and been chosen by, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned the difference between justice and revenge, between building and destroying, between becoming bitter and becoming better. Outside, the city hummed with the life of people going about their business in buildings that were safe, on streets that were properly maintained, in a community where most people kept their promises and did their jobs honestly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of story that made headlines or inspired movies, but it was real. It was honest. It was his. And in the end, that was the only revenge that mattered. The end.